Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be exploring something pretty amazing. We're going to be looking at the idea of fasting, but not just, how to fast, like the nuts and bolts. And we're going to go deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
You're going to understand, like, why did people do this historically? And what's the spiritual significance of it? And we've got some incredible sources, like ancient Christian writings, insights from modern-day pastors. It's going to be fascinating. What do you think?
I think so too. And it is interesting. Nowadays people think about fasting and they think about like a diet or a cleanse or something like that. But historically, fasting has been this huge part of so many different religious practices.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
I'll be honest, like I used to think it was just about like deprivation. You're giving something up as like a punishment.
Right.
I don't know, like I never really got it.
Well, and it is interesting. I mean, the Hebrew word for fasting literally means to close or cover the mouth. So it's not about starving yourself. It really is about this intentional shift away from physical needs
Oh, interesting.
to focus more on your spiritual growth.
So it's not about what you're giving up, but more about like what you're choosing to focus on instead.
Exactly. So it's about dedicating your time to spiritual priorities. Instead of eating a meal, you're praying, you're connecting with God, things like that.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense. Now, you mentioned some ancient Christian writings. One that comes to mind is the Didache. What is that exactly?
The Didache, it's like this first century manual for Christian living.
Oh, cool.
It was written sometime between 50 and 100 AD, so it's super old. And it gives us this like glimpse into the lives of the early Christians,
Wow.
what they did, how they practiced their faith. And one of the really interesting things that the Didache reveals is the connection between fasting and love.
Fasting and love. Okay, now that's not a connection I would have made right off the bat.
I know. It's not what you think of right away, right?
Yeah.
But the Didache says that these early Christians, they fasted for the people who were persecuting them.
Oh, wow.
They saw it as this like ultimate act of love and compassion, even for their enemies.
Wow, that's really challenging.
It is. It really makes you think, like, what are you willing to fast for?
Yeah.
It shows a real deep spiritual maturity.
So they fasted for their enemies. What else does the Didache tell us about how they practiced fasting?
Well, another thing is that they would fast before baptism. And it wasn't just the person being baptized. The whole community would fast with them.
Really, the whole community?
Wow. And it really shows how seriously they took this. This
Yeah.
wasn't just some like symbolic thing. This was like intense preparation. It was purification, and they were seeking God's guidance. So you can see that, yeah, fasting was just a central part of their lives, their spiritual lives.
Okay, so we've got these early Christians, and fasting is super important to them, but it doesn't stop there, right?
Yeah,
Like, we have modern-day pastors who also talk about the importance of fasting.
we do. Yeah.
One that comes to mind is Dr. Myles Munroe.
Yes.
He was amazing. He called fasting the kingdom key to power and prayer, didn't he?
Yeah. He said that. And he saw it, as this way to just amplify your connection with God.
Okay.
Like it was like putting a turbocharger on your spiritual engine.
I love that. That's a great analogy. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. He used the image of a pipe
Okay.
to represent like our capacity to receive from God. He said that normally our capacity is like this small rusty pipe,
Okay.
and it limits how much of God's power can flow into our lives. But then he said that fasting is like clearing out all those blockages, right?
Uh-huh.
Widening that pipe so that more of God's power can flow through.
Oh, okay. I see. So by denying our physical needs, we're kind of like creating more space for God to work in us.
That's a great way to put it.
It's almost like, I don't know, like a spiritual form of decluttering or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he really believed that fasting could lead to breakthroughs in prayer, that you could get a deeper intimacy with God. You could even find freedom from like negative habits or spiritual strongholds.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah.
Like, it really makes you think, what could be possible in our lives
Yeah.
if we embraced fasting with the same intentionality as those early Christians.
Right. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
And speaking of those early Christians, the Didache actually reveals something else that's pretty interesting about how they fasted. It might even surprise you.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. What did they do that was so different?
Well, the Didache tells us that they actually chose to fast on different days than the Pharisees did.
Oh, really? Why is that? Like, were there certain days that were considered more holy or like better for fasting or something?
It wasn't really about the days themselves being holier. It was more about, well, the Pharisees, they were known for being super strict about following all the religious laws, and they would fast on Mondays and Thursdays.
Yeah.
But Jesus, he had actually criticized them for being hypocrites. He pointed out that their fasting was often more about like outward appearances than, genuinely humbling themselves before God.
Oh, okay. So the early Christians were kind of like making a statement then, like they were distancing themselves from that kind of showy spirituality.
Exactly. They didn't want their fasting to be seen as, hypocritical or self-righteous.
Right.
So they chose to fast on Wednesdays and Fridays instead. It was subtle, but it was definitely a way of setting themselves apart.
Wow. That's pretty powerful.
Mm.
I mean, it really shows how committed they were to living out their faith authentically, even in something as personal as fasting.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes you think about how we approach fasting today,
Yeah, it does.
Are we doing it for the right reasons? Are our hearts in the right place?
That's a good question. But, before we go too deep into like the motivations behind fasting, I think it'd be helpful to like maybe talk about some of the practical stuff. We were talking earlier about how to actually fast.
Yeah.
And I know the Bible mentions different types of fast, right?
It does.
Like we talked about the complete fast where you give up food and water, but I remember you mentioning some other ones too. Can you remind me what those were?
Yeah, of course. So another common type of fast is what's called a partial fast.
Okay.
And that's where you abstain from certain types of food or drinks, but not all of them.
Right.
Like a good example of that is the Daniel fast.
Oh yeah, the Daniel fast. I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's based on the prophet Daniel.
What exactly does that involve?
Well, typically it focuses on a plant-based diet. So you're abstaining from like rich foods, meats, sweets, things like that.
So this is more about simplifying your diet and focusing on like whole foods.
Exactly. It's about making intentional choices about what you consume.
Okay. So it's not just about deprivation then.
Right.
It's also about like what you're choosing to focus on instead.
Yeah. And that actually highlights another key principle of fasting. It's not just about what you're abstaining from,
Yeah.
but it's about what you're choosing to like focus on instead.
So like replacing, I don't know, those earthly pleasures with spiritual pursuits.
Exactly. It's about prioritizing prayer, spending time in God's word, creating space for him to speak to you. You're aligning your heart and mind with his will.
I'm really starting to see how fasting can be so much more than just this like physical discipline. It's a way to like cultivate spiritual hunger, a thirst for God.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to what we were talking about with Dr. Munroe.
Okay.
He believed that fasting combined with prayer and studying the scriptures could really unlock some incredible spiritual power.
Yeah.
He often talked about like the life-changing effects of fasting,
Right.
from breaking free from bad habits, to hearing God's voice more clearly, all sorts of things.
I remember you mentioning that earlier. Can you give some like specific examples of what Dr. Munroe taught about the benefits of fasting?
Sure. So Dr. Munroe believed that fasting could help you break the hold of like fleshly desires, so it'd be easier to overcome things like addictions, unhealthy patterns, even negative thought patterns. He saw it as a way to like weaken the influence of the flesh and empower the spirit.
So it's about creating a shift in power, like from the flesh to the spirit.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about how much our culture emphasizes like instant gratification.
Yeah.
Indulging those physical desires.
Absolutely. And when it comes to like hearing God's voice, think about all the distractions we face on a daily basis. Our
Yeah.
phones, our to-do list, just the constant barrage of information. It's crazy. But fasting, it can create this space of quiet and stillness,
Yeah.
It allows you to tune in to God's whispers a little easier.
Yeah. I can totally relate to that. I struggle with like quieting my mind, being present in prayer. It sounds like fasting could be a really powerful tool to like overcome those distractions, and deepen my connection with God.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just about finding peace and quiet either.
Okay.
Dr. Munroe also believed that fasting could lead to breakthroughs in prayer. Like it could open doors for
Wow.
God to move in your life in ways that you never even thought were possible.
It's amazing how something as simple as like abstaining from food can have such a huge impact,
Yeah.
like spiritually and practically.
Mm.
But what about people who are like maybe hesitant to try fasting.
Yeah.
Maybe they've heard negative things or they have like misconceptions about what it entails. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, it's understandable. There are definitely a lot of misconceptions about fasting out there.
Yeah,
Some people think it's about punishing yourself, or like trying to earn God's favor or something, but that's not what it's about at all.
right. It's not about deprivation or trying to like manipulate God.
Exactly. It's about intentionally shifting your focus,
Yeah.
from the physical to the spiritual. It's about humbling yourself before God, seeking his face, aligning your heart with his will.
So it's more about surrender than striving.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And when you approach fasting with that right heart, with the right intentions, it can be this incredible journey,
Yeah.
a journey of spiritual discovery and growth and getting closer to God. But there is one crucial aspect of fasting that we haven't really touched on yet. And it's something that Jesus himself actually emphasized in his teachings.
Oh, okay. I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What did Jesus have to say about fasting that was so important?
Well, he warned against doing it for show,
Okay.
like to impress other people. He said, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting." So, it's not about outward appearances or trying to get recognition from others.
It's about keeping your fast between you and God.
Exactly. He went on to say, "But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly."
It's a good reminder that it's about seeking intimacy with God, not attention from people.
Yeah. And it's about trusting that God sees your heart. He honors your humility even when nobody else notices. But, speaking of practical tips and guidance, there is another modern day pastor whose insights on fasting I think could be helpful for our listeners.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Who's that? Oh, yeah. Who are you thinking of?
Well, we've talked about the Didache, we've talked about Dr. Munroe, but when it comes to like practical advice for how to actually fast, Pastor Ted Shuttlesworth has some really helpful insights.
Okay, yeah. I've heard his name. What does he say about like approaching fasting in a practical way?
Well, one of the things he really emphasizes is the importance of starting small.
Okay.
You don't have to jump into a multi-day fast right away, especially if you're new to this.
That's probably a good idea. It could be kind of overwhelming, to think about giving up food for days at a time,
Yeah.
especially in our culture where it's like food is everywhere.
It is. And Pastor Shuttlesworth, he actually suggests beginning with something that's a little more manageable, like maybe just a 12-hour fast or even just skipping a meal.
Okay.
You can gradually increase the duration,
Yeah.
as you get more comfortable and as the Lord leads.
So it's about listening to your body and not pushing yourself too hard.
Exactly. Remember, fasting shouldn't feel like a punishment. It should be a journey of drawing closer to God. And sometimes, that means starting slowly and gently.
Yeah, I think I've always been kind of intimidated by the idea of fasting. But hearing it like that, it makes it seem a lot more approachable.
I'm glad to hear that. And if you are looking for some practical tips or maybe some support, Pastor Shuttlesworth actually created something called a fasting starter kit.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's got tons of information about, different types of fasts, how to prepare, what to expect, even how to break a fast safely.
Oh, wow. That sounds super helpful.
It is. It is.
I'll definitely include a link to that in the show notes for our listeners.
Awesome. Yeah. It's a great resource for anyone who's new to fasting or just wants a little guidance on, how to incorporate it into their lives.
Perfect. So we've got, start small. What other like practical tips do you think would be beneficial?
One thing that I found to be really helpful is to be mindful of your environment during the fast.
Okay.
Try to create a peaceful atmosphere for yourself. Maybe set aside some time for prayer, meditation, read your Bible, listen to some worship music.
It's like creating a spiritual oasis in the middle of your day.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. It's a space where you can intentionally connect with God without all the distractions. And remember, fasting is not just about abstaining from food.
Right.
It's about replacing those physical cravings with spiritual nourishment. So, be intentional about filling your heart and mind with things that will draw you closer to God.
It's like feasting on God's word and his presence, even as we abstain from physical food. I love that.
I like that too. And speaking of feasting, we can't forget about the importance of breaking a fast properly.
Oh, that's true.
That's just as crucial as the fast itself.
I imagine it would be tempting to like overindulge after you've been abstaining, but you're saying that's not the best approach.
Yeah, you want to ease back into eating gradually. Start with small, light meals and avoid anything that's too heavy or too rich, especially if you've been fasting for, an extended period.
Okay.
Give your body time to adjust. And more importantly, remember that breaking a fast is a time to reflect on your experience, to thank God for his guidance and to consider how you can continue to cultivate those spiritual disciplines that you've been practicing during the fast.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in just like checking a box.
It
It's
is.
like completing the challenge. But really, it's about letting that experience transform us.
Absolutely. It's about taking those lessons that you've learned, that intimacy you've experienced with God, and carrying that into your everyday life.
Wow, this has been such a good conversation. I feel like we've covered so much, from the history of fasting all the way to like practical tips for how we can do it today.
It's been great. I'm really glad we got to explore this topic together, and I hope our listeners feel encouraged and inspired to embark on their own fasting journeys, seeking God's guidance every step of the way.
Yeah, me too. And as always, we'll include links to all the resources we mentioned in the show notes.
Awesome. Definitely check those out. And remember, fasting is not just some ancient practice.
Right.
It's a powerful tool for spiritual growth and transformation, and it's available to us today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into fasting. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.